Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Soviet Union. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1960, when the world held its breath, watching the space race between two superpowers, something happened in the vast steppes of Kazakhstan that would remain buried in classified files for decades. The Baikonur Cosmodrome, that symbol of Soviet technological prowess, became the stage for an event so disturbing that even today, those who know the truth speak only in whispers. The official records show that Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space on April 12, 1961. But what the archives do not mention is the man who orbited Earth 9 months earlier, on a cold February morning in 1960. A man whose name was methodically erased from every document, every photograph, every memory of those who witnessed his launch. They called him Cosmonaut Zero. The story begins in the industrial city of Magnitogorsk, where 32-year-old pilot D.V. lived a life that seemed designed for anonymity. Born in 1928 to a family of steel workers, V had distinguished himself as an exceptional pilot during the Korean conflict, though his service records, like so many others, carried the stamp of state secrecy. His superiors described him as methodical, precise, and most importantly, silent about matters of state importance. In late 1959, V received orders to report to a facility that officially did not exist. The journey took him across the Ural Mountains to a complex of buildings surrounded by endless steppe, where the horizon seemed to swallow all hope. This was Star City, the training center where the Soviet Union forged its cosmic pioneers in absolute secrecy. The selection process for cosmonauts was brutal in ways that went beyond physical endurance. Candidates underwent psychological examinations designed to break the human spirit and rebuild it according to state specifications. V excelled not because he was fearless, but because he possessed something his instructors valued more than courage: complete emotional detachment. Training records from that winter describe a man who could endure isolation chambers for weeks without showing signs of psychological deterioration. While other candidates cracked under the pressure of simulated space conditions, V remained perfectly calm, as if his mind had already learned to exist in the void. His instructors noted this quality with a mixture of admiration and unease. By December of 1959, only 12 candidates remained from the original pool of over 200. V was among them, but there was something different about his evaluations. While other candidates were assigned numbers and code names, V's file simply read Subject 0. No explanation was provided for this designation. The winter training intensified with exercises that pushed human endurance beyond recognized limits. Candidates were subjected to prolonged weightlessness simulations, extreme temperature variations, and psychological stress tests that left several men hospitalized with what the reports euphemistically called adjustment disorders. V completed every test without complaint, without question, without apparent emotion. His fellow candidates began to avoid him, not out of animosity, but because something in his presence made them deeply uncomfortable. Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Belyaev, who would later become famous as part of the Voskhod II mission, wrote in his private diary, "V moves among us like a man who has already died. He speaks when spoken to, follows orders perfectly, but his eyes look through us as if we are already ghosts." The psychological profiles painted a picture of a man who had somehow disconnected from normal human emotional responses. Dr. Yelena Sokolova, The facility's chief psychiatrist recommended V for immediate psychological evaluation and possible removal from the program. Her recommendation was overruled by higher authorities, and Dr. Sokolova was transferred to a research facility in Siberia within a week. As January 1960 arrived, the Cosmonaut program entered its final phase. The Vostok spacecraft had completed numerous unmanned test flights, some successful, others ending in catastrophic failure. The pressure from Moscow to achieve the first manned spaceflight was enormous, particularly with intelligence reports suggesting that American astronaut programs were advancing rapidly. It was during this period that V began to display behaviors that concerned even his most hardened instructors. He would stand for hours at the training facility's windows, staring at the night sky with an intensity that made observers uncomfortable. When asked what he was looking at, he would simply respond, "Calculating the distances." The technical teams responsible for the Vostok program were working around the clock to resolve critical safety issues. The spacecraft's life support systems had shown alarming inconsistencies during testing, and the heat shield technology remained unreliable. Several engineers privately expressed concerns that sending a human on the current version of Vostok would be tantamount to murder. These concerns reached the highest levels of government, where a decision was made that would haunt everyone involved. Rather than delay the program and risk losing the space race to the Americans, authorities decided to proceed with a test flight using a volunteer who understood that survival was not guaranteed. They needed someone who would not panic, would not break radio silence, and would not become a propaganda disaster if things went wrong. V volunteered immediately when the nature of the mission was explained to him. His response, according to witnesses, was simply, "When do we launch?" No questions about survival odds, no requests for additional safety measures, no concern for his family or future. Just cold acceptance of what everyone understood might be a death sentence. The launch was scheduled for February 15th, 1960, in complete secrecy. Only essential personnel were present at Baikonur, and all participants were required to sign documents that carried penalties of imprisonment or death for unauthorized disclosure. Even the technicians preparing the Vostok capsule were told this was another unmanned test flight. In the days leading up to launch, V underwent final medical examinations and psychological evaluations. The medical reports describe a man in perfect physical condition, but the psychological assessments paint a more disturbing picture. Dr. Viktor Petrov, who replaced Dr. Sokolova, noted that V showed complete emotional detachment from outcome scenarios and absence of normal survival instincts. More troubling was V's response when asked about his family. He had been married to Anna V.A. for 8 years, and they had a 6-year-old daughter named Katya. When asked if he wanted to send any message to his family before the potentially fatal mission, V responded, "They will be informed of whatever they need to know." He showed no desire to see them before launch, no emotional distress at the possibility of never returning. On the night before launch, the few witnesses reported that V spent the entire evening sitting in his quarters, completely motionless, staring at the wall. Guards checking on him found him in the exact same position hours later, as if he had achieved some form of suspended animation while awake. When morning came, he dressed methodically and reported for pre-flight procedures without a word. The launch took place at exactly 6:47 in the morning, Moscow time. The Vostok rocket lifted off perfectly, carrying V into an elliptical orbit that would take him around Earth once every 90 minutes. For the first time in human history, a man was truly alone in the cosmic void, separated from his home planet by the absolute darkness of space. Radio contact was established immediately after orbital insertion. His voice came through the speakers at Mission Control with mechanical precision, reporting telemetry data and system status with no emotional inflection whatsoever. Flight director Sergei Korolev noted that V sounded like a machine reading data, which was exactly what they needed for a mission this sensitive. But something began to change as the hours passed. V's scheduled reports continued to arrive precisely on time, but subtle alterations in his speech patterns became noticeable to the linguists monitoring communications. He began to speak more slowly, with longer pauses between words, as if the act of forming speech was becoming increasingly difficult. During his third orbit, approximately 4.5 hours into the flight, V made an unscheduled transmission that chilled everyone in mission control. Instead of his usual technical reports, his voice came through the speakers saying, "The darkness here is not empty. It is full of spaces between spaces. I can see the intervals where nothing exists." Mission Control attempted to re-establish normal communication protocols, but V continued, "Earth looks very small from here, so small that I cannot understand how there was ever room for all the noise. Everything is quiet now. Finally quiet." The flight director ordered all non-essential personnel removed from Mission Control. Only 5 people remained to witness what happened next. Korolev himself, 2 flight engineers, a communication specialist, and a KGB observer whose name appears in no official records. These 5 men would carry the burden of what they heard for the rest of their lives. His transmission continued for another 17 minutes, but what he described defied all understanding of human psychology and spaceflight experience. He spoke of seeing the places where stars used to be, of sensing movement in the spaces behind the darkness, and of feeling the weight of all the silence that exists between worlds. Most disturbing were his observations about Earth itself. Looking down at the planet from orbit, V reported seeing the scars where the continents remember being torn apart, and the shadows of all the people who are no longer there. His voice remained calm throughout these transmissions, as if he was simply reading technical data. During his 5th orbit, the life support systems began showing irregularities exactly as engineers had feared. Oxygen levels fluctuated wildly, carbon dioxide scrubbers showed signs of failure, and the cabin temperature started dropping toward lethal levels. Mission Control prepared to initiate emergency deorbit procedures, but V's response to these developments was unlike anything they had anticipated. Instead of showing concern for his deteriorating situation, V seemed almost pleased. His transmission came through clearly. "The systems are beginning to understand. The machine knows what I know now. It is learning to be quiet too." When Mission Control attempted to walk him through emergency procedures, he responded, "Emergency implies something unexpected. This is all perfectly expected." The decision was made to bring V back immediately, but the deorbit sequence required precise timing and his active cooperation. The flight engineers began transmitting instructions for the retro-rocket firing sequence, but V's responses became increasingly erratic and philosophical rather than technical. "You want me to fall back into the noise," he transmitted, "but I have found the place where everything is finally silent. Why would I return to a world that cannot stop screaming?" Mission Control repeated the deorbit instructions with increasing urgency, but V seemed to be having a different conversation entirely. As his 6th orbit began, the life support situation became critical. With less than 2 hours of breathable air remaining and cabin temperature dropping below survival levels, the window for safe return was closing rapidly. But His transmissions suggested that he no longer viewed survival as a relevant concern. "From here, I can see the wars that have not happened yet," he reported. "I can see the places where cities will be built and then forgotten. Everything down there is temporary, but this silence is permanent. This is where I was supposed to be all along." The mission control team made the decision to override manual controls and initiate automatic deorbit sequence, but the Vostok spacecraft's automated systems were primitive and unreliable. The retro rockets would fire in approximately 45 minutes during V's seventh orbit. Whether he cooperated or not, it was during this final orbit that V made the transmission that would haunt the survivors forever. His voice came through the speakers with perfect clarity and complete calm. I understand now why they chose me for this mission. They needed someone who would not mind being erased, someone who was already empty enough to carry the emptiness of space back with them. He paused for nearly 3 minutes, and Mission Control feared they had lost contact entirely. Then his voice returned. "But I will not be coming back. Not the way you expect. The person who returns will be someone else entirely. He will look like me, speak like me, but he will be filled with this silence, and slowly, very slowly, that silence will spread." The automatic deorbit sequence initiated successfully, and the Vostok capsule began its descent toward the designated landing area in Kazakhstan. Radar tracked the spacecraft through its re-entry trajectory, and recovery teams were dispatched to the projected landing site. But what they found when the capsule was opened would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in Soviet history. The man who emerged from the Vostok capsule was physically identical to DV. Medical examinations showed no apparent damage from the flight, no signs of physical distress or psychological breakdown. But everyone who encountered him immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed. The man who returned was not quite the same man who had launched. Recovery team leader Major Boris Petrov reported that when they opened the capsule hatch, the returning cosmonaut sat perfectly still for several minutes, making no attempt to exit or communicate. When he finally spoke, his first words were, "The silence followed me home." He moved with mechanical precision, responded to questions with technical accuracy, but something essential seemed missing. During debriefing sessions, the returned V provided detailed reports on all aspects of the flight, answering every technical question with perfect recall. But when questioned about his philosophical transmissions during the mission, he showed no memory of making them. According to the transcripts, when played recordings of his own voice describing spaces between spaces and the weight of silence, he listened with apparent interest but no recognition. Dr. Petrov, the facility psychiatrist, noted that the returned V displayed complete emotional normalization compared to his pre-flight detachment. He seemed more animated, more socially engaged, more conventionally human than before the mission. Yet this improvement felt profoundly wrong to everyone who observed it, as if they were watching a performance rather than genuine human behavior. The psychological evaluations continued for 6 weeks. The returned V passed every test, showed no signs of space-related trauma or psychological damage, and expressed eagerness to return to duty. But his responses were almost too perfect, as if he were following a script for how a recovered cosmonaut should behave, rather than genuinely experiencing normal human emotions. Most disturbing was his complete lack of curiosity about the gap in his memory. When informed about the duration and content of his unscheduled transmissions, he accepted this information without question or concern. A normal person would want to understand what had happened to them during those hours in space, but the returned V seemed entirely uninterested in the experience he could not remember. 3 months after the flight, the decision was made to classify the entire mission beyond top-secret classification levels. All personnel involved were transferred to different assignments, scattered across the Soviet Union to prevent any possibility of coordinated disclosure. The few written records of the mission were either destroyed or buried so deeply in state archives that they effectively ceased to exist. The returned V was given a new identity and assigned to a routine position at a regional airfield in Ukraine, far from any space-related programs. His wife Anna and daughter Katya were informed that he had been killed in a training accident, and they received full survivor benefits and a military funeral with a closed casket. They never learned that the man they buried was a fiction, but the returned V continued to exist under his new identity, and his presence began to affect those around him in subtle but disturbing ways. Colleagues at the airfield reported that conversations with him left them feeling empty and disconnected. Workers would find themselves standing in silence for long periods after speaking with him, as if his presence had somehow drained the desire to communicate. Local authorities began receiving complaints about unexplained phenomena in the area surrounding the airfield. Residents reported that their radios would spontaneously fall silent during certain atmospheric conditions, that birds would stop singing when flying over specific areas, and that some locations seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. These reports increased in frequency and geographic scope as months passed. In December 1960, a meteorologist named Dr. Alexei Morozov arrived at the airfield to investigate reports of acoustic anomalies in the region. His preliminary research suggested that certain areas around the facility were experiencing localized disruptions in sound propagation, as if something was interfering with the normal physics of audio transmission. Dr. Morozov's investigation led him to interview personnel at the airfield, including the man who had once been DV. During their conversation, Dr. Morozov noted that he began to experience what he described as cognitive quieting, a sensation that his thoughts were becoming less frequent and less urgent. He found himself forgetting what he had intended to ask in the middle of questions. The phenomenon began to spread beyond direct contact with the returned cosmonaut. People who had conversations with those who had spoken with him reported similar experiences of mental quieting and emotional detachment. It was as if the silence from space was propagating through human contact, like a psychological contagion, growing stronger and more noticeable with each transmission. By spring 1961, the situation had become serious enough to attract attention from Moscow. A special commission was formed to investigate the Baikonur incident, though the commission members were not fully briefed on the classified details of the original mission. They were told only that a psychological contamination event had occurred and needed to be contained. The Commission's investigation revealed that the acoustic anomalies were expanding in a rough circle centered on the airfield where the returned V worked. Sound recording equipment placed throughout the area showed progressively degraded audio quality as measurements were taken closer to the epicenter. More troubling, the personnel operating this equipment began displaying the same emotional flattening experienced by others who came into extended contact with the phenomenon. Dr. Morozov, who had been studying the effect for months, submitted a report that would be immediately classified and never officially acknowledged. His findings suggested that the returned cosmonaut was somehow serving as a vector for psychological void propagation, though he admitted that he had no scientific framework for understanding how such a thing could be possible. The report described the returned V as appearing to be a human-shaped absence rather than a human presence. Dr. Morozov theorized that whatever had happened to DV during his time in space had created something that existed in the physical form of a human being, but carried within it some essential quality of the cosmic void itself. As the spring of 1961 progressed, the silence continued to spread. Small towns within 50 kilometers of the airfield began reporting unusual social changes. Community gatherings became less frequent. Conversations grew shorter and less animated, and a general sense of emotional numbness settled over the population. People continued their daily routines, but with diminishing enthusiasm or apparent purpose. The Soviet space program, meanwhile, was preparing for Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, which would officially mark humanity's first venture into space. The success of this mission was crucial not only for propaganda purposes, but also for concealing the true nature of what had happened with the classified flight months earlier. If Gagarin's mission succeeded and he returned psychologically intact, it would provide cover for the ongoing investigation of the earlier incident. Gagarin's flight on April 12, 1961, proceeded exactly as planned. He orbited Earth once, reported normal psychological and physiological responses throughout the flight, and returned as a celebrated hero. The contrast between his successful mission and the classified events surrounding Cosmonaut Zero could not have been more stark. But even as the world celebrated Gagarin's achievement, the situation in Ukraine continued to deteriorate. The commission investigating the Baikonur incident had reached a disturbing conclusion. The psychological contamination was not stabilizing or diminishing over time. Instead, it appeared to be growing stronger and expanding its geographic range at an accelerating rate. The decision was made in June 1961 to implement what internal documents euphemistically called a permanent containment solution. The returned V was informed that he was being transferred to a special research facility for routine psychological evaluation related to his service record. He accepted this information without question or emotion, just as he had accepted everything else since his return from space. The facility where he was taken exists in no official records. Built in a remote area of the Kamchatka Peninsula, it was designed specifically to house individuals who posed unique security risks to the state. The returned V was installed in quarters that were comfortable but completely isolated from any human contact beyond essential maintenance personnel. Even in isolation, however, the effect continued to manifest. Staff members who spent time near his containment area reported the same progressive emotional numbness and mental quieting that had plagued those in Ukraine. The facility's psychological evaluation protocols broke down as the evaluators themselves became too affected to maintain professional objectivity. Dr. Yelena Sokolova, the psychiatrist who had originally recommended Vida's removal from the Cosmonaut program, was brought in to assess the situation. Her preliminary report stated simply, "The subject continues to function as a vector for psychological void contamination, even in complete isolation. Physical proximity appears to be the primary transmission factor, but the effect may be strengthening over time rather than diminishing." By autumn 1961, the decision was made to implement the most extreme containment measures possible. The returned V was moved to a specially constructed chamber deep underground, with all human contact eliminated entirely. Food and supplies were delivered through automated systems, and all observation was conducted via remote monitoring equipment. Yet even these measures proved insufficient. Maintenance workers who serviced the automated systems began showing signs of the psychological effect. Despite having no direct contact with the contained individual, it became clear that proximity to the facility itself was enough to trigger the contamination process, suggesting that the returned V's influence was somehow permeating the physical environment around him. The final solution was reached in December 1961. A team of engineers constructed a specially designed containment unit that would maintain life support for the returned V, while keeping him in complete sensory and environmental isolation. This unit was then loaded onto a cargo aircraft and transported to the most remote location available to Soviet authorities. According to classified documents that surfaced decades later, the aircraft flew north over the Arctic Ocean and released its cargo at coordinates that placed it hundreds of miles from any land mass. The containment unit was designed to sink to the ocean floor, where water pressure and distance from human populations would provide theoretically permanent isolation. The aircraft crew reported that as the containment unit disappeared into the dark Arctic waters, their radio communications spontaneously cleared up and became crisper than they had been in months. Several crew members noted that they suddenly felt more alert and emotionally engaged than they had since beginning work on the project. It was as if a weight they had not realized they were carrying had suddenly been lifted. The communities in Ukraine that had been affected by the expanding silence began to show signs of recovery over the following months. Conversations gradually became more animated, social gatherings resumed their normal frequency, and the general emotional numbness that had settled over the region slowly dissipated. The acoustic anomalies that had puzzled scientists disappeared entirely by spring 1962. Dr. Morozov, who had documented the entire phenomenon, submitted a final report that would remain classified until the dissolution of the Soviet Union 3 decades later. His conclusions were both scientifically unprecedented and deeply disturbing. He theorized that human consciousness might be more fragile than previously understood, capable of being fundamentally altered by exposure to environments completely outside normal evolutionary experience. The implications of his research suggested that space travel might pose psychological risks that went far beyond anything anticipated by mission planners. If isolation in the cosmic void could somehow erase essential human characteristics and replace them with something else entirely, then the future of human space exploration might require psychological preparation that no one had considered necessary. But these concerns would remain buried in classified files, and the official space program continued to advance without acknowledging the potential psychological dangers of extended isolation in space. Future cosmonauts and astronauts would venture into the void without knowing what had happened to the man who had gone before them. The records of DV's original existence were so thoroughly expunged that by 1965 no trace of him could be found in any Soviet archive. His wife Anna remarried and moved to a different city, and his daughter Katya grew up believing her father had been a low-ranking military officer who died in a training accident. The truth of his transformation and ultimate fate remained known only to a handful of officials who took their secrets to their graves. In 1967, a Soviet nuclear submarine conducting deep-sea research in the Arctic Ocean reported detecting an unusual sonar signature at extreme depth. The signature appeared to be artificial rather than natural, suggesting the presence of a manufactured object on the ocean floor. When asked to investigate further, the submarine crew reported experiencing communication difficulties and crew morale issues that resolved immediately upon moving away from the location. No further investigation was authorized, and the coordinates of the detection were classified beyond top-secret levels. The submarine's captain noted in his personal log that the ocean seemed too quiet in that area, as if the normal sounds of marine life and water movement were somehow being absorbed or suppressed by something on the seafloor. These would be the last official reports related to the Cosmonaut Zero incident. The Soviet Union's space program continued to achieve remarkable successes throughout the 1960s and 70s, sending numerous cosmonauts into orbit and beyond. None of them experienced the psychological transformation that had befallen DV, suggesting that either the phenomenon had been unique to his individual psychology or that subsequent safety measures had prevented its recurrence. But occasionally, in the decades that followed, there were troubling echoes. Astronauts and cosmonauts from various nations would sometimes report unusual psychological experiences during extended solo flights. They described sensations of profound isolation that went beyond normal loneliness, feelings that space was somehow aware of their presence, and disturbing alterations in their perception of time and consciousness. These reports were typically attributed to the known psychological stresses of space travel and were addressed through improved training and mission support. But a few individuals within the space agencies began to wonder whether these experiences represented something more significant than simple psychological adjustment to an unusual environment. Dr. Morozov, who had documented the original incident, continued his research throughout the 1960s and 70s. Working independently and without official support, he developed theories about what he called consciousness contamination vectors and psychological void states. His work suggested that human identity might be far more environmentally dependent than anyone had previously suspected. His research indicated that consciousness might be a more fragile phenomenon than traditionally believed, capable of being fundamentally altered by exposure to environments that fell completely outside the range of normal human experience. If this were true, then the cosmos itself might pose threats to human psychology that were as dangerous as radiation or vacuum exposure. But these theories remained speculative and unpublished. Dr. Morozov died in 1979, and his research materials were never found, despite extensive searches by his colleagues. Some suspected that his work had been confiscated by authorities who preferred that such questions remain unanswered, while others believed he had destroyed his findings himself, concluding that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. The truth about what happened to DV during his 9 hours in space may never be fully understood. The psychological transformation he underwent defied all conventional understanding of human consciousness and identity. Whatever force or phenomenon he encountered in the cosmic void had the power to erase the essential characteristics that make a person human and replace them with something that appeared human but was fundamentally different. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond the historical curiosity of a single classified space mission. As humanity ventures deeper into space and spends longer periods isolated from Earth, the psychological dangers encountered by Cosmonaut Zero may represent a preview of challenges that future space travelers will face. The silence that DV brought back from space was not simply the absence of sound, but the absence of something essential to human consciousness itself. That silence was contagious, capable of spreading from person to person and gradually draining away the emotional and psychological qualities that define human experience. If such a phenomenon could be triggered by exposure to the cosmic void, then space exploration may require psychological safeguards that no one has yet conceived. The isolation of space may not be simply a challenge to overcome, but a fundamental threat to human identity itself. The story of Cosmonaut Zero serves as a reminder that the universe is vast and indifferent to human needs and understanding. The silence between stars is not empty, but filled with forces and phenomena that human consciousness may not be equipped to comprehend or survive. Those who venture into that silence must be prepared for the possibility that they may return fundamentally changed. And somewhere in the absolute darkness of the Arctic Ocean floor, that silence may still be waiting. The containment unit that carried the returned V into the depths was designed to last indefinitely, maintaining its cargo in perfect isolation from the world above. But the ocean itself is not truly isolated, connected as it is to every other body of water on Earth. Perhaps it is merely coincidence that marine biologists began reporting unusual phenomena in Arctic waters during the 1980s and 90s. Dead zones where fish populations suddenly disappeared, areas where whale songs seemed to be absorbed rather than echoed, and deep-sea research equipment that malfunctioned in specific locations for no apparent technical reason. These reports were typically attributed to pollution, climate change, or equipment failures. But a few researchers noted that the affected areas seemed to be expanding slowly outward from a central point, following ocean currents that connected the Arctic to every other sea on the planet. The official position of all space agencies remains that the psychological risks of space travel are well understood and manageable through proper training and support. The existence of Cosmonaut Zero is not acknowledged in any public document, and the classified files related to his mission remain buried in archives that may never be opened. But the silence he brought back from space may not have been permanently contained. It may be spreading still, carried by currents both oceanic and atmospheric, gradually permeating the world with the same emptiness that transformed a human being into something else entirely. And if that silence continues to spread, future generations may find themselves living in a world where human consciousness gradually becomes as empty and cold as the space between stars. The void that DV encountered may have been patient enough to wait decades for its contamination to reach every corner of the Earth. The last documented reference to the Cosmonaut Zero incident appears in a personal journal found among the effects of a Soviet space program administrator who died in 1987. His final entry, written shortly before his death, consisted of a single sentence: "The silence is spreading faster now, and sometimes I can feel it calling me home to the emptiness between worlds." Whether this represented the final thoughts of a dying man or a genuine observation about an ongoing phenomenon may never be determined. But the possibility remains that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, or in the deeper darkness of the ocean depths, the silence that once was DV continues to exist, waiting for the opportunity to reclaim the world from which it was exiled. The space race that captivated the world during the 1960s was built on dreams of human expansion into the cosmos. But the story of Cosmonaut Zero suggests that the cosmos may have its own plans for humanity, and that the silence between stars may be far more dangerous than the vacuum that surrounds them. Today, as private companies prepare to send civilians into space and governments plan missions to Mars and beyond, the classified files of Cosmonaut Zero remain sealed. The lessons learned from DDV-IS's transformation have never been incorporated into astronaut training or mission planning protocols. Current space agencies operate under the assumption that the psychological challenges of space travel can be managed through conventional mental health support and crew rotation schedules. They design missions based on the successful experiences of hundreds of astronauts and cosmonauts who have returned from space psychologically intact. But none of those subsequent space travelers spent 9 continuous hours alone, in the absolute isolation that V experienced. Modern space missions are carefully planned to minimize psychological stress through constant communication with ground control, predetermined schedules that prevent extended periods of inactivity, and crew rotations that ensure no individual spends excessive time in complete isolation. The protocols developed after Gagarin's successful mission were specifically designed to prevent the kind of psychological breakdown that affected Cosmonaut Zero, though the official reasoning cited general mental health concerns rather than the specific phenomenon that had been documented in the classified files. In 1996, when the Soviet archives were partially declassified, researchers searching for historical space program documents discovered references to Subject Zero and Baikonur incident in several inventory lists. However, the actual files referenced in these inventories had been permanently removed, with notations indicating transfer to special archive storage in 1961. Dr. Viktor Petrov, the psychiatrist who had evaluated the returned V, died in 1993 without ever speaking publicly about his experiences. His personal papers, discovered after his death, contained only one reference to the incident, a single page with the words, "Some silences are contagious," written repeatedly until the page was filled. The remote facility in Kamchatka, where V had been initially contained, was abandoned in 1975 and later demolished. Local residents reported that the area remained unusually quiet for years after the demolition, with wildlife avoiding the location and vegetation growing in strangely uniform patterns. As humanity prepares for longer space missions and permanent settlements on other planets, the story of Cosmonaut Zero serves as a warning that may never be heeded. The psychological dangers he encountered represent threats that current space medicine does not acknowledge and cannot prepare for. The silence that transformed DV from a human being into something else entirely may still be waiting in the vast emptiness between worlds. And as more people venture into that emptiness, the risk increases that someone else may encounter whatever force or phenomenon claimed the first human to truly experience the absolute isolation of space. The cosmos remains as vast and indifferent as it was when V first gazed into it from orbit. The darkness between stars continues to hold secrets that human consciousness may not be equipped to comprehend. And somewhere in the depths of the Arctic Ocean, or in the silence between worlds, the echo of what once was DV may still be calling others to join him in the emptiness. Until someone finally opens those sealed files and acknowledges what happened in February 1960, the true risks of human space exploration will remain hidden. And the silence that began with one man's transformation may continue to spread, carried by forces and vectors that no one fully understands. The space race never truly ended. It simply changed from a competition between nations to a challenge between human consciousness and the vast, patient silence of the cosmos itself. And in that ongoing contest, the final outcome remains far from certain.